Snow was piling against my office window when the email popped up. Revised will, final draft. Names Nate Carver, 52, Chief Financial Controller. And the radiator's hiss was the only sound while my father's gold pocket watch ticked on my desk. Ever had a single line of text make you question everything you thought was settled? Snow had been falling since dawn, the kind that drifts sideways on the wind and sticks to the edges of the office windows. From my desk on the 3rd floor, I could see the Penobscot River glazed with ice, a lone gull cutting across the gray sky. The radiator beneath the sill hissed and popped, as if it were annoyed to be working so hard. I leaned back, took a sip from coffee, gone lukewarm, and clicked open my email. The subject line was blunt enough to set my pulse jumping, revised will, final draft. For a second I thought it might be a routine update from the trust officer, some clause about the mill property, or a note about the cabin lease up north. Then the PDF loaded and my name wasn't there. Not under the cash distributions, not under personal effects, not anywhere. My father's gold pocket watch lay on the blotter in front of me, its hands moving with stubborn precision, as if time had no idea the ground had just shifted beneath me. I ran my thumb over the shallow dent in the case one I'd made years ago when I dropped it on the deck of his boat. I scrolled up and down the pages, half expecting the omission to be some glitch in the formatting, but the new list of beneficiaries was tidy neat and free of my name. I could feel the radiator's dry heat against my shins, and still there was a chill threading up my spine. Something wrong. The office clerk Kim poked her head in to drop off a stack of invoices. She wore her winter hat indoors, the knit pulled low over her ears. "Nothing urgent," I said, sliding the invoices over the email window. My voice came out flatter than I meant. She gave me a look the kind people give when they know something's off, but don't want to be the one to ask, and backed out of the room. I stared at the screen another moment, then picked up the phone and dialed Audrey Pike at the courthouse. Her line rang twice before she answered, brisk as ever. "Probate Court, Audrey speaking." "Audrey, it's Nate Carver. I got something in the mail I need to confirm." "All right," she said, and I could hear the click of her keyboard. "There's a revised will for my father, Robert Carver. Filed when—" She was quiet for a beat, then said, "Last week. Filed by counsel for your brother, I believe." The radiator popped again, a sharp sound in the small office. "That's fast," I said. "Uh-huh." Another pause, the kind that carries more weight than words. "Nate, you didn't hear this from me, but Lee was in here 2 days ago. Sat right where you'd be sitting if you came in. Looked like he was in a hurry." I watched the snow flurries spin beyond the glass, tiny dancers in the wind, the gulls cutting low over the docks. "Thanks, Audrey," I said. "You didn't get this from me," she repeated, and hung up. For a long moment I stayed still, listening to the low hum of the radiator and the faint creak of the old window frame in the wind. My father's watch ticked on the desk, steady, stubborn. I reached for the printer icon, sent the file to the machine in the corner. The pages came out warm and smelling faintly of toner. I stacked them with the original will, slid the folder into the bottom drawer of my desk, and turned the key in the lock. Outside, the river's surface shifted under the wind, a patch of open water rippling among the ice. I couldn't see the far shore through the haze, but I knew it was there. Some things you have to take on faith until the day you can prove them. My mother's voice came over the line, thin and frayed. "Don't make this into a big thing, Nathaniel." She hadn't called me that in years. I told her I was just stopping by, no agenda. "Bring your boots," she said, and hung up. Her house sat where Bangor thinned into wood's porch swing groaning in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of pumpkin bread and damp pine. In the hallway, a photo of us 3 kids outside Dad's lumber shop, 1984, smiled with the brittle glaze of old varnish. In the kitchen, she called. Miriam was in her blue cardigan dish towel over one shoulder. She hugged lightly, guarding her ribs. We spoke in detours, her church bazaar, my work at the docks. Each time I mentioned the will, she steered away. Weather says sun by Friday, she offered sliding the bread into the oven. I asked about the garage. Mind if I clear a few boxes? She waved me off. The bulb flickered as I stepped in. The air was damp cardboard rubber and gasoline. Dad's shelves sagged under bankers' boxes marked shop statements, insurance taxes. The old space heater hummed a faint ribbon of warmth. I opened one box, neat registers envelopes of canceled checks, manila folders with greened fasteners. I set the scanner to work, feeding pages slowly, bank statements from the Timber Trust, end-of-year summaries. The USB grew warm under my thumb. My mother's footsteps crossed above kettle lid, rattling. I kept my pace, casual as if tidying. A thin folder labeled Whitcomb Probate 2004 made me pause. Horace's name in Dad's tidy script. I slid it through the scanner, noting gaps in the usual disbursements and odd transfers to an unfamiliar account. A yellow sticky note with a penciled question mark went on top. The garage door creaked. Mrs. Dwyer from next door peeked in with a casserole dish. "Saw your brother downtown yesterday," she said, eyes flicking to me. "With a young lawyer, Shiny Shoes Exchange Street office." Mother clicked her tongue, but the seed was planted. When the last page scanned, I ejected the USB, its metal still warm, and slipped it into my coat's inner pocket. Boxes went back on the shelves, lids snug. In the kitchen, the bread steamed on a cutting board. We ate quietly. She told me about a neighbor's wandering cat. I mentioned the river's black seam of open water. Neither of us said will or lawyer. At the door, she touched my sleeve. "Be kind. Be careful." I promised I would. Rain misted the windshield as I sat in the truck, glove box light casting a pale glow. On a notepad, I wrote 3 names: the bank officer, the courthouse clerk, and Horace Whitcomb. I opened a new email. "Horace, it's Nate. Coffee soon. Need your advice." I sent it before I could think twice, then watched her kitchen light fade in the mirror as I eased down the road. The bell over the cafe door gave a soft jangle as I stepped in from the brittle January air. The scent of fresh waffles and brewed coffee hit me first, followed by the slow warmth of pine-paneled walls that had held heat since morning. Horace was already in the corner booth, his back to the wall-eyes on the door, like a man who had spent a lifetime reading people before they sat down. "Still got your father's watch?" he asked, voice gravelly but steady. His coat was folded beside him, brim of his fedora tilted just so. I slid into the seat opposite and let the booth creak under my weight. "Always," I said, taking the watch from my pocket and setting it between us. Its gold face caught the dim light ticking steadily against the lacquered wood. Horace nodded once, as if the sight had settled some internal measure. He pulled a folder from his leather briefcase and flipped it open to reveal both versions of the will original on the left, revised on the right. "First thing I see," he said, tapping his fountain pen against the page, "is that whoever drafted this didn't expect anyone to compare line by line." The cafe owner passed by with a carafe topping our mugs. Steam curled upward, leaving a small halo of condensation on the rim. Outside, pedestrians hunched against the wind, their boots crunching over patches of ice. Horace leaned in. "Your brother's lawyer made clean edits, but not invisible ones. Clause about the timber trust payouts, gone in the new draft. And the phrasing on the house subtle, but it shifts the timing of transfer. This is the kind of rope that, given enough time, can trip the other side." I sipped my coffee, letting the bitterness ground me. "So what's the move, Patience?" he said, resting the pen along the crease of the folder. "Let him think the field is clear. A rushed adversary makes mistakes." I reached into my coat and set the USB on the table. It was still faintly warm from my pocket. "Scans from my mother's garage, statements, receipts, an old probate folder with your name on it." Horace's mouth twitched into something between approval and amusement. "You've always been thorough." He plugged the drive into a small laptop he'd pulled from the briefcase, fingers moving with the kind of economy that comes from decades in practice. The screen's glow reflected in his glasses as he scrolled through the files. He stopped pen tapping once, twice. "Here." He turned the screen so I could see transfers from the family timber trust to an account number neither of us recognized. The amounts were irregular, the timing suspicious just after the will had been revised. "That account isn't in the trust documents," he said. "If it's what I think it is, we may have just found our fulcrum." The cafe owner returned with a plate of waffles for another table. The scent of butter and syrup briefly filled the air between us. Horace closed the laptop, sliding the USB back to me. "When the moment comes," he said, eyes sharp under the brim of his hat, "we'll turn the table so hard they won't see it coming." I pocketed the drive, feeling its weight like a promise. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the glass, and the booth creaked as we stood. The watch in my pocket ticked on steady as the plan taking shape between us. Late afternoon settled heavy over my mother's backyard, the air damp with the smell of wet leaves and turned soil. Along the fence, old clay pots huddled together, chipped and moss-threaded. The wind moved through the pines with a low, warning hush, clouds piling gray on gray above the tree line. Lee stood by the picnic table, arms crossed, jaw set. He didn't glance at the kitchen window where Mother might be listening. His eyes were fixed on me. "I could have done this in town," I said. "I want it said here," he answered, nodding toward the stump where Dad used to split kindling. "You never pulled your weight, Nate. Not here. Not when it counted." I let the words land. "You kept the shop alive. I kept the books straight and the suppliers honest." "That's paperwork," he shot back. "Dad changed his mind for a reason. He saw who showed up." Wind tugged at the apple tree branches. From inside came the faint murmur of the radio. A cupboard door closing. "We can go through the papers together." I tried. "No lawyers?" "You always want papers," he said. He told me he was fixing what should have been fixed. "You mean the week the new draft was filed? When you were at Exchange Street?" His jaw tightened. He stepped closer. Wet leaves ground under my shoes. The damp smell of clay rose from the pots. His shoulder brushed mine as I shifted back just enough to knock the watch from my vest pocket. It hit the patio with a sharp, brittle crack, louder than the wind. I bent and picked it up. A clean fracture ran across the glass, the face spidered into fine lines. The second hand trembled before forcing itself forward. "I didn't." Lee began stopping with his palms open. "It's all right," I said, though it wasn't. "Things break when you lean on them long enough." "You'll use that," he muttered. Stand in court, say I broke your toy and the shop's yours. I'll stand up and tell the truth. About transfers that weren't in the trust. About backroom meetings. About how Dad never wrote anyone out without saying it twice and signing it 3 times. He changed his mind. He repeated softer. That's what the court is for, I said. The kitchen door opened. Mother's head appeared in a puff of lemon-scented steam. Boys, she called, the rain's coming. We're done, I told her, slipping the cracked watch back into my pocket. Rain dotted the concrete around our shoes. Lee nodded, turned toward the side gate. He told me, he said, without looking at me. I heard you. The latch clicked. The gate closed. Rain stitched the pines into a curtain. I stayed by the table listening to the gutters fill the furnace cough inside. My phone buzzed. On the screen, Horace. I found what will end this. The wind shifted. I typed back when and where. Then I went inside to tell my mother it would be all right, or at least past the point where pretending could help. Snow powdered the courthouse steps in a fine wind-blown drift, each flake settling over stone worn smooth by 100 winters. Lee stood at the top like a host at his own banquet, shaking hands with cousins we hadn't seen in years, nodding gravely to men from the Rotary. His coat collar was turned up just enough to look purposeful, not enough to hide the half-smile he aimed at me when our eyes met. It was the smile of a man who thought the script had already been written and that he held the last page in his pocket. Inside the vestibule, the air was close and warm, smelling faintly of floor wax and old heating ducts. Horace was beside me, fedora in his lap, the knot of his tie drawn tight against his throat. He leaned toward me without looking, his voice low enough to be part of the hum of shuffling shoes, and murmured greetings. Wait until the 10th minute, he said. Let them talk first. A man will tell you everything, if you give him rope and silence. Courtroom 2 had the sober geometry of a place designed to hold both time and consequence. Dark oak panels framed the judge's bench. The wall clock above it ticked in a measured, audible way, as if each second was being recorded separately in the court's memory. I followed Horace to our table, the fractured glass of my watch catching the fluorescent light in a brief, cold glint. The shuffle of leather-soled shoes on polished wood mingled with the creak of benches as people settled in. Judge Marlowe entered tall spare, her robe settling about her shoulders like it belonged to her as much as her own skin. She glanced once at the docket, once at the room. We are here to consider the validity of the revised testamentary document submitted by Mr. Lee Carver, she said, her voice carrying in the oak-paneled hush. Lee's lawyer rose first, a man with a careful haircut and a stack of papers that seemed designed to look unassailable. He presented the updated will with a tone that suggested the matter was a formality. The original, he argued, had been superseded by my father's clear, recent intent. The court need only confirm what was already evident. I kept my gaze on the tabletop, listening to the scratch of his pen as he pointed to clauses and signatures. Horace sat motionless beside me, only the rhythmic tap of his fountain pen against the folder giving away the slow cadence of his thoughts. When the 10th minute arrived exactly by the watch in my pocket, Horace stood. "Your Honor," he said before we respond to counsel's summary, "I'd like to enter 3 exhibits into the record." The judge nodded, and Horace passed the first document to the clerk, a printed, time-stamped email scheduling the will change. This was sent by the law firm to my client's brother, Mr. Lee Carver, 3 weeks before the document was executed. Horace said, "Note the phrasing. Bring Miriam at the time specified. Sedation will be arranged." The second exhibit was the law firm's own appointment log, its columns neat in black ink. This shows an unscheduled meeting on the very day the original will was amended. Horace continued. The entry is initialed by the junior partner who has since left the firm citing ethical concerns. Finally, Horace turned to the small screen set up by the clerk. Exhibit 3 is courthouse security footage from that day. The lights dimmed slightly as the video played our mother, pale and slow-moving, was escorted into the building by Lee, her steps uncertain. The timestamp matched the log exactly. A pause. Then the image of her leaning on the counterpen in hand, her signature wobbling across the page under the steadying grasp of Lee's free arm. A faint, steady horn from a fogboat in the harbor outside filtered through the closed windows, low, resonant, and slow. The sound seemed to make the room stiller, as though everyone was waiting for its echo to fade before breathing again. Judge Marlowe raised a hand. "We will take a brief recess," she said, her eyes fixed on the screen a moment longer before turning to the bailiff. "Counsel approach. The exhibits will be reviewed in chambers." The benches creaked as people shifted, murmurs passing from row to row like a small, careful fire. I could see Elspeth, our sister, lean forward in her seat, her lips parted as if to speak, but choosing not to. Horace sat back down without looking at me, folding his hands over the pen. "Patience," he murmured. It was nearly 20 minutes before the judge returned, robes swaying with each deliberate step. She seated herself, adjusted the papers before her, and then looked directly at Horace. "You may proceed with your supplemental," she said. The room held its breath. I felt the weight of the cracked watch in my pocket, its ticking almost lost under the slow, certain beat of the wall clock above the bench. Horace laid the sealed envelope on the counsel table with a small, deliberate motion, the sort of gesture that carried weight without raising his voice. It was cream stock, heavy in the hand, with a neat rectangle of red wax pressed over the flap, the bank's insignia deep in the seal. Afternoon light from the frosted courthouse windows fell across it, turning the wax into a muted ember against the dark wood. Beyond the glass, snow drove sideways on a stiff wind, a steady patter against the panes, like fingernails testing for weakness. My thumb grazed the cracked glass of my father's watch in my vest pocket, feeling the ridge where the clean surface had splintered. The second hand ticked on, stubborn, oblivious. Lee sat across the aisle, jaw tight, eyes narrowed toward the envelope, as if he could see through to its contents. "Your Honor." "Horace," said voice even. Judge Marlowe's chin dipped in permission. With a slim blade, Horace eased the wax away and drew out a folded document sealed in a thin protective sleeve. The soft rip of the envelope opening seemed louder than the shuffle of leather soles on the courtroom floor. He handed the sleeve to the clerk, who slid the paper free and placed it on the projector. The image bloomed on the wall, my father's handwriting in bold, confident loops across the page, the way he'd sign a manifest at the docks, quick but with authority. Above it, the bank's letterhead. Below, the date 6 months older than the so-called revised will. "This," Horace said, "is the original bequest addendum held in Northern Penobscot Savings Secure Records Vault. Its seal was intact this morning. The signature matches authenticated samples from decades of Mr. Robert Carver's business dealings." The bank officer took the stand, silver badge pinned to her blazer. She explained the dual-key vault, the sign-in log, the video surveillance, her testimony crisp as frost on glass. No one accessed this envelope until today, she concluded. The seal was intact. Next came the handwriting analyst, a calm man in wire-rim glasses. He displayed blown-up signatures on an easel. My father's firm strokes in one set the unsteady pressure, heavy marks on the revised will in another. These deviations are consistent with coercion or physical impairment, he said. They are not consistent with Mr. Carver's known writing habits. Lee's lawyer half rose, then sat back down, objection dying in his throat. The air in the room tightened. Judge Marlowe's gaze lingered on the documents. Then she nodded. "Clerk, please read the pertinent portion into the record." The clerk rose paper in both hands. Her voice carried clearly. $3,800,000 to my son Nathaniel Carver, to be held or used at his discretion, with preference for community initiatives consistent with our family's work. A ripple of sound passed through the gallery gasps, a murmur, the creak of benches. Elspeth's scarf slid from her shoulder. She didn't move to catch it. Lee's shoulders squared, then slumped a fraction. Mother, from her place in the second row, met my eyes. She gave no smile, only a small, slow nod. The judge's gavel tapped once, sharp and final. The court accepts the original addendum. The later document is set aside. A written order will follow. Horace slipped his pen into his jacket. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the windows. Clumps of snow dropped from the ledges with muffled thuds. Lee stared down at the table, unmoving. Behind him, a cousin coughed into a gloved fist. The crowd began to rise. I stayed seated, hand closed around the watch, feeling its faint pulse against my palm. Horace leaned toward me. "This is where you breathe." I stood, scanning the room until my gaze found Elspeth, then Mother again. We gathered our papers and moved toward the door, the smell of damp wool coats mingling with the faint scent of floor wax. Just before we reached the threshold, my phone vibrated one short pulse. "Mr. Carver." "We followed the proceedings today. If you remain interested in partnering to support forestry students in Penobscot County, we'd be honored to work with you." I slipped the phone back into my pocket beside the watch. Both were warm now, one from my hand, the other from the message it carried. Outside, the snow was falling harder, smoothing every edge. Horace adjusted his hat. "Let's mind the exits," he said. I nodded. Stepping into the hall's muted light, the click of the gavel still echoing somewhere ahead of me, and the promise in that email humming like an engine ready to turn over. The bell above the watchmaker's door gave a bright, almost delicate chime as Horace and I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of oiled brass, and something older dust worked into the grain of wooden display cases, warmed by the angled spring sunlight filtering through front windows. All around, the quiet tick of 100 clocks filled the room. Grandfathers with polished pendulums, squat plastic alarm models, gilded carriage clocks, each marking time in its own stubborn measure. Bram the watchmaker emerged from a back workbench. His hair was the color of steel shavings, his magnifying loupe still perched in one eye. Without a word, he reached beneath the counter and brought up a small square of dark velvet. Nestled in the center was my father's watch. The cracked glass was gone, replaced with a clear face that caught the light without splinter. The case shone, but not too much. Bram knew the difference between restored and erased. I picked it up, felt its warmth from his hands. The second hand swept as evenly as the day I'd inherited it. "It's whole again," I said more to myself than to Bram. He nodded once. "It'll outlast both of us if you mind it." Horace stood to my right hat in his hand-eyes on the watch. "Good reminder," he said, "that not every break has to be the end of a thing." He waited until Bram disappeared into the back before lowering his voice. "About Lee, If you want peace, you'll have to let him choose whether to take it. You've won the matter of the will. That doesn't mean you win the rest. I turned the watch over in my palm, feeling the slight weight shift as its movement ticked on. I'm not looking to win the rest, I said. Just to carry what's mine the right way. We sat at a small side table where Bram sometimes took payment. Horace spread out the trust paperwork for the Maine Forest Scholarship Fund. The pages were thick, the kind that slowed your pen just enough to make every letter deliberate. The scent of machine oil clung to the air as I signed my name at the bottom of each document, the slight drag of ink across the fibers making a quiet counterpoint to the ticking around us. Horace leaned back, giving one of his slow nods, the kind that settled a thing in place. "I'll stand as honorary trustee," he said. "Keeps the fund honest and keeps you from carrying the whole weight alone." I slipped the last signed page into the folder. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The message was short, the sender unmistakable. Lee. "Meet me at the old mill tomorrow." I looked at Horace. "He wants to meet." Horace's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Then meet him, but keep the watch close." I slid the restored watch into my vest pocket. The weight was the same as before, but it felt different, less like a relic, more like a tool. Outside, the sunlight caught on the shop's brass door handle as I pushed it open, and the bell gave its clean, bright chime again. The library's meeting room carried that blend of varnished pine and brewed coffee you only find in public spaces that have hosted decades of pancake breakfasts and PTA meetings. Snowmelt pooled in shallow puddles outside the wide windows, sending streaks of pale light across the floor. Near the podium stood a wooden plaque, draped with a square of dark cloth, the edges hinting at its careful joinery. I could feel the weight of my father's watch in my vest pocket, steady and warm, ticking toward a moment I'd been building for longer than I realized. Neighbors filled the folding chairs with the quiet familiarity of people used to seeing each other in grocery aisles and post office lines. Horace sat near the front hat on his knee, his gaze carrying that easy alertness I'd come to trust. Elspeth was on the aisle scarf, wrapped twice, as if she were bracing for more than cold. My mother slipped in last, her gloves still damp from the walk, and took a seat without fuss. Even Lee had found his way here, though he stood at the back near the coat rack half-shadowed by the door. I stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it out of habit, and looked over the room. When I was young, my father taught me how to read a board. Not just if it was straight, but how the grain told you where it might bend, where it might split. He said the wood keeps talking after the tree's down, you just have to listen. Murmurs quieted, and I felt the air lean in. This fund is a way to keep listening. The Maine Forest Scholarship will help students learn to work with the land the way we were taught, with care, patience, and respect. Steam curled from coffee cups in the back as I described the basics. Endowment sized the board's roll, Horace agreeing to serve as honorary trustee. Then I set my notes aside and told them about a day at the mill when my father stopped everything to run his hand along a split plank, reading it like Braille. "We'll use it differently," that's all he'd said. That was the point. You don't throw something away because it changed. You figure out how it still fits. From a folder I drew the first scholarship certificate. "Ella Martinez," I announced. A young woman in a wool sweater rose, making her way forward with the stiff steps of someone not used to being the center of a room. Her handshake was firm, her smile quick, and when I passed her the paper, her thank you carried further than the applause that followed. Still, the applause came warm, rolling, filling the room like spring meltwater. 2 students pulled the cloth from the plaque revealing the carved words, Carver Forest Scholarship Stewardship Craft Community. The grain ran straight, satin-finished, catching the last of the afternoon light. It looked like it belonged. As the room broke into smaller knots of conversation, I stepped down. Elspeth touched my sleeve in passing. Horace was already speaking to the reporter. Mother found me, rested her hand on my wrist, and said quietly, "Your father would be proud." Before I could answer, I noticed Lee watching. He didn't wave or smile, just gave a small nod and opening, nothing more but enough to change the air between us. People began drifting toward the doors. I helped stack a few chairs, then followed the stream outside. The slush squeaked under boots. The church bell down the block started to ring, each tone carrying clean in the cold. On the library steps, I took out the watch, flipped it open. The hands moved with their same unhurried sweep. The new glass clear, the case polished but still bearing the faint scuff Bram had left. I liked that it remained. It made the thing real. I pulled out my phone. Lee's old message was still there. Meet me at the old mill tomorrow. I typed coffee sometime and hit send. The bell tolled again. The watch ticked on, and I slipped both back into my pocket. The street ahead was wet and glinting, narrowing toward the corner where I'd turn for home, the sound of the bell following me just long enough to make the silence that came after feel earned. The winter light outside the library had turned soft, brushing the snow with hints of rose and gold. In my pocket, the watch ticked without hurry, its glass whole, its face clear proof that some things can be repaired if you care enough to try. I'd learned that justice isn't always loud, and that mending family takes more patience than winning in court. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can see which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone standing in the middle of loss or conflict, there's still a path forward even if it starts with the smallest nod. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?